Tataha, thereafter. Kati Payai, a few. Masai, months passing. Vrishni, the descendants of Vrishni. Boja, the descendants of Boja. Andaka Adaya, and others like the sons of Andaka. Jayu went. Prabhasam, the place of pilgrimage named Prabhas. Sambristaha, with great pleasure. Ratai, on their chariots. Deva, by Krishna. Vimohita, bewildered. Translation: a few months passed, and then, bewildered by Krishna, all the descendants of Vrishni, Boja, and Andaka, who were incarnations of demigods, went to Prabhasa, while those who were eternal devotees of the Lord did not leave, but remained in Dwarka. So we'll go on to the next verse. I'll just read it. Tatra snatva pritrindevan rishims chaiva tadambhasa tarpa yitvata viprebhyo gavo bahu gunadaduhu. Tatra, there, snatva, by taking bath, pritrin, forefathers, devan, demigods, rishin, great sages, cha, also, eva, certainly, tat, of that, ambasa, by the water, tapayitva, by pleasing, ata, thereupon, viprebhya, unto the brahmanas, gavaha, cows, bahuguna, greatly useful, dadhu, gave in charity. Translation to verse 26. After arriving there, all of them took bath, and with the water of this place of pilgrimage, they offered their respects to the forefathers, demigods, and great sages, and thus satisfied them. They gave cows to the brahmanas in royal charity. Please repeat after me. After arriving there, all of them took bath, and with the water of this place of pilgrimage, they offered their respects to the forefathers, demigods, and great sages, and thus satisfied them. They gave cows to the brahmanas in royal charity. So reading the purport. Amongst the devotees of the Lord, there are several divisions, mainly Nitya Siddhas and Sadhana Siddhas. The Nitya Siddha devotees never fall down to the region of the material atmosphere, even though they sometimes come onto the material plane to execute the mission of the Lord. The Sadhana Siddha devotees are chosen from the conditioned souls. Out of the sadhana devotees, there are mixed and pure devotees. The mixed devotees are sometimes enthusiastic about fruitive activities and are habituated to philosophical speculation. The pure devotees are free from all these mixtures and are completely absorbed in the service of the Lord, regardless of how and where they are situated. Pure devotees of the Lord are not enthusiastic to put aside their service to the Lord in order to go visit holy places of pilgrimage. A great devotee of the Lord in modern times, Sri Narottam Das Thakur, has sung like this: to visit holy places of pilgrimage is another bewilderment of the mind, because devotional service to the Lord at any place is the last word in spiritual perfection. For pure devotees of the Lord who are completely satisfied with the transcendental loving service of the Lord, there is hardly any necessity to visit the various places of pilgrimage. But those who are not so advanced have the prescribed duties of visiting pilgrimage sites and regularly performing the rituals. The part of the princely order of the Yadu dynasty who went to Prabhasa performed all duties to be done in a place of pilgrimage and offered their royal actions to their forefathers and others. As a rule, every human being is indebted to God, the demigods, great sages, other living entities, people in general, forefathers, etc., for various contributions received from them. Thus, everyone is obliged to repay the debt of gratitude. The Yadus who went to the Prabhasa pilgrimage site performed their duties by distributing land, gold, and well-nourished cows in royal charity, as described in the following verse. So after arriving there, all of them took bath, and with the water of this place of pilgrimage, they offered their respects to the forefathers, demigods, and great sages, and thus satisfied them. They gave cows to the brahmanas in royal charity. So Prabhupada's giving lots of information here in this verse. So it continues the description that's given in verse 25, narrating how the descendants of Vrishni, the descendants of Boja and Andaka, they all came to this, all incarnations of the demigods, and they all came to this holy place of Prabhasa. I'm not quite sure where Prabhasa is. Do you know, Maharaj? No. Where Prabhasa is?
Vaschetra is near Dwarka.
So near Dwarka. And the eternal devotees, however, just stayed in Dwarka. They didn't leave. So in first canto, in 11th chapter, verse 11, it describes how Dwarka was protected by these descendants. And they were very, very powerful. They're all, they're given all the strongest Krishna, actually. And it describes the example of how the Nagas, the great snakes, protected Nagaloka. So they had this duty towards Krishna that they were also helping him protect Dwarka. And then in the next chapter, 341, the Brahmanas gave permission to the descendants of Vrishni and Boja to eat the feast. So after the great sacrifice, Rajasuya sacrifice, they have the great feast. And because Kshatriya is sometimes allowed to drink alcohol, it wasn't, like the alcohol you buy, or one could buy in a shop, but it was made out of fermented rice. And sometimes in Bengal, you'll find that they call it, what do they call it? I forget the name of it, but they make it out of actually fermented rice. So they had this intoxicating drink. And as Maharaj was explaining recently in class, the reeds had actually been made from the iron filings from when Samba was misbehaving, and he tricked the sages. They're a group of little louts, and pretending to be Samba was pretending to be a pregnant lady, and he went to the sages and said, "So, great sage, what will my child be, a boy or a girl?" So they got very annoyed about that. It's the thing with great sages. Sometimes they're very kind and very merciful, and they give lots of benedictions, and other times, watch out. You'll really be suffering the consequences of misbehavior. So, he was cursed, of course, as you know, to give birth to the lump of iron. That iron, he was advised then to grate all of that iron away, and they threw it in the water. But of course, that later became reeds. So when they were all drinking and they were getting intoxicated and they started to get rowdy and they started to fight with each other, thinking the reeds are just reeds, but they weren't. It was all Krishna's plan, all of Krishna's yoga maya, the plan to take away all the descendants because Krishna was getting ready to depart the planet. And in that, Prabhupada talks about alcohol. He says drinking alcohol is so harmful that even such a highly cultured family becomes affected by intoxication and can forget themselves in a drunken state. So these are very elevated, very cultured relatives of Krishna. They weren't ordinary souls, and still they became intoxicated. And you can see if you live in a city, you can see if you have to go somewhere on a Friday evening after work. Friday night is the night that all the workers, all the non-devotees, that's when they can relax after a hellish week of struggling so hard on this whole little track of Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. They go, yay, it's Friday. And often companies will dress in mufti, so it means that they don't have to wear their suits and ties. And then Friday night, they just go, trying to forget all the stress of the week And then, of course, Saturday night, and then Sunday they're suffering, and Monday they come to work and they're miserable, and the whole cycle starts again. So you can see, if you've had the misfortune of seeing intoxicated people, in a minute the mood can change. They can go from being jovial to being antagonistic and wanting to, beat somebody up. So they fought with the reeds from that iron bolt that Samba gave. And however, as I said, this was all done by the will of the Lord, all done by his Yoga Maya. And the Lord's members, they were either plenary incarnations or demigods from the heavenly planets, as Prabhupada mentions in this purport. And so before his departure, he separated them by his internal potency. It was time to start shifting things around, preparing everyone for when he was departing. So before they went to their respective abodes, they all went to, some stayed in Dwarka, some went to this holy place and they bathed there and they gave in royal charity to the Brahmanas. So that whole aspect of charity during a yajna is so important. And actually, when the priest performs the yajna, if he's not given some dakshin, then the yajna becomes useless. So it's part of an exchange that whatever it is, if it's a yajna for giving a child their first grains, or if it's a marriage, any of these things, if there's not charity then given to the priest, the brahmanas, then all of the pious activities or the pious results of that yajna is null and void. So it's very important, that whole charity aspect. So we can't conclude that the Yadus and the Bojas were just, drunkards in an ordinary situation. They were very elevated and they were very special. And it was a way for Krishna to enact his plan. And Prabhupada says that Jiva Goswami, he likens this to magical performances of Krishna. So they were very special. And, when you examine or you read about the different stories, like, for example, Samba, and then the filings, and then they become reeds, and then there's always a reason for these things to happen. So when you go through the Mahabharata and you read these pastimes, you know that there's going to be some very special reason why these things happened. It's all part of that magical performance. So in the purport to text 26, Prabhupada talks about some different points. So he talks about the divisions of the devotees of the Lord. You've got your Nitya Siddhas and you've got your Nitya Sadhana Siddhas, or the Nitya Sadhana Buddhas. Then he talks about visiting the holy places in relationship to devotional service. And then he talks about our debts. As soon as a living entity is born, in human form of life, at least, there's debts. We've got many debts. And Prabhupada talks about those. And then he talks about the correct behavior in performing our duties. So let's talk about the first one, or I'll talk about the first one, you can listen. The categories amongst the devotees. So Prabhupada gave us a description of the Nitya Siddhas and the Nitya Sadhana Siddhas. So he says that Sadhana Siddhas are conditioned souls who have achieved self-realization through the perfection of their sadhana. So that is where one can, by perfect sadhana, one can reach perfection. Of course, we can rely on another category, which is Kripa Siddha, that we can reach perfection by the mercy of the pure devotee. So that's a very wonderful category to be part of. And then Prabhupada talks in that purport how the sadhana siddhas, they're divided, there's another two categories. So there's the mixed and the pure devotees. And the mixed devotees still have some, jaggic, jnani aspects that they want to perfect. They may be caught up in some other kind of, philosophical exercise, but still they can reach perfection. And in seventh canto, Prabhupada gives another definition just to add to the categories. And you notice when you study the scriptures, there's always so many categories and so many numbers. It's all very interesting. So Prabhupada gives another definition to these categories. He says that there are devotees who are a combination of Nitya Siddha and Sadhana Siddha. And he gives the example of Prahlad Maharaj and Narada Muni. So they're mixed, not that they have any material aspect, but they have pure devotional perfection, and then they are also Nitya Siddha. So it's kind of an interesting combination. So they have their eternal perfection, and then how they perfectly execute their devotional service. So we know Prahlad Maharaj, he perfected his devotional service by always remembering the Lord. And of course, Narada Muni, he's constantly singing the glories of the Lord. And traveling everywhere. So he's perfectly executing his devotional service, although they are not contaminated. So I just mentioned this, not to throw a spanner in the works, but just to highlight how there's so many different nuances in the study of Srimad Bhagavatam, the study of the Bhakti scriptures. It's not always just a black and white, cut and dried. So that's why it's so important that we read and we study Prabhupada's books very carefully, because it helps us develop that more nuanced attitude to devotional service and to the scriptures. So in this purport, Prabhupada's explaining that mixed category of sadhana siddhi. They're sometimes enthusiastic about prurative activities, and they're habituated to philosophical speculation. So there's not that total purity there. They still have some material conditioning. And the pure devotee category, Prabhupada says, however, there's never any influence of material nature. They're always completely absorbed in bhakti. They're eternally liberated souls. So now to the next point. So we talked about those categories, and now it's visiting the holy places in relationship to devotional service. So he discussed how visiting the places of pilgrimage is very good when we're in our conditioned state. But he also describes how the pure devotees, they're not so enthusiastic to leave their service and go to a holy place. And Prabhupada's a perfect example of that, because he was very happily situated in Radha Damodar Temple in Vrindavan, reading, studying, praying, totally self-satisfied. But because his spiritual master ordered him, you must go and preach this philosophy in the West. That was Prabhupada's plan. So he was preparing himself, getting ready. So he could have just stayed very happily in Radha Damodar, but rather he chose to voluntarily undergo great difficulties. And we know when we read Lilamrita, Prabhupada Lilamrita, that he was on the Jaladuta at 69. He turned 70 in the next day or the day after, or on the voyage he turned 70, and he had no wherewithal, he had no money, he had a vague connection with someone in Boston. So Prabhupada took all of that on voluntarily. He could have very easily stayed. And of course, subsequently, he travelled the globe something like 13 or 14 times. The jet lag that we would suffer, Prabhupada never allowed that to impede his schedule. Prabhupada was so regulated. So he'd, go for his walk. He'd do his translating. So pretty much in whatever condition he was, Prabhupada would always have that time for the translation. And of course, managing a society, and we were all very inexperienced. We were all probably, caused Prabhupada so much trouble. And Prabhupada managed, along with all of his other responsibilities, he managed the society that was spreading like wildfire all around the world. So what did some other things Prabhupada do unflaggingly? I mentioned translating and I mentioned managing. Is there anything else? Yes, he always went for his morning walk. He didn't always, but when he got sick in New York, there's the devotees called the doctor, and the doctor said to Gagamuni and Brahmananda, that old man's praying too much. He needs to go for a walk. So they passed that on to Prabhupada. So as soon as Prabhupada recovered a bit, he would have that morning walk every day. And he wouldn't walk slowly. His younger, his disciples who were decades younger than him had a hard time actually keeping up with Prabhupada. He walked very, very quickly. And of course, that they're all the kind of, in a way, external things, but internally Prabhupada was always in communication with Krishna. He's suppressed his ecstatic symptoms a couple of times. They leapt out that he didn't control. But Prabhupada always had also this, inner life that was so much beyond our understanding of what it was. But because we understand that wherever we are and we're chanting Hare Krishna and we're rendering devotional service, we are actually in the Holy Dham. It's very, very important. But having said that and having read this purport, and it says that, we don't need to go to the Holy Dham, but when we're in a conditioned state, it's very important. And Prabhupada actually wanted us to go once a year to the Holy Dham. I'm 2 years overdue from going because he wanted us. Why do you think he wanted us to go to the Holy Dham? Yeah, very good. Recharge our spiritual batteries. And when just before that first International Gaupani Festival, where devotees from all around the world came, one of the TPs in America didn't want the devotees in his temple to go because it would have caused so much financial difficulty. So they would have had the cost of the airfares, they would have had the lost income because the devotees were raising funds every day. There would have been the extra responsibility for the few devotees that left behind that they couldn't go. The rent still had to be paid. So all of these things was combining to be a big, big financial burden. And he went to Prabhupada and said, oh, this is not such a great idea. It's going to cost us. And he had analysed it all. This is going to cost us for this, that, and that, and that. And Prabhupada wasn't impressed. Wasn't impressed with it at all. He said, no, let them go, notwithstanding all of these things. I'm not sure if Prabhupada said eat less prasadam and save money that way. I'm not sure about that. But he definitely, despite all of the adding up, because Prabhupada understood that in our neophyte stage, going to the Holy Dham is so purifying. Just to touch the holy dust, the heart becomes so uplifted and so purified. But it doesn't mean that we abandon our service here on a whim. It has to be arranged with the temple president and worked out, devotees can follow everything. And in second canto, chapter 3, verse 22, Prabhupada says, one should not visit all these sanctified pilgrimage places and temples with sightseeing in mind. One must go to such temples and sanctified places immortalized by the transcendental pastimes of the Lord and be guided by proper men who know the science. So it's very wonderful when you visit the Holy Dham, you can go on Prikram with senior devotees who can tell you all the wonderful stories like Dinabandhu Prabhu and Indradumna Swami and, so many other wonderful devotees. So it's a great opportunity to, when you go to Mayapur and Vrindavan or Jagannath Puri, to actually take that time to suck in all of that transcendental nectar and not spend so much time in Loy Bazaar. getting very attracted to all of the anarkalis and the saris. And another interesting point is that when you visit the holy place, because many, many people are coming, and what happens when they get to the holy place? All of their sins are taken away. So when you bathe in the Ganges, all of your sins are gone. You come out of the Ganga or the Jamuna, and of course then we start committing more sins. And Prabhupada gives that example. It's like the elephant. He goes and has a nice bath in the river, comes out, and what does he do? He gets dust and throws it all over his body again. So that's very important. And Prabhupada explains that when the pure devotee goes to the holy Dham, because those sins, let me step back a little bit, those sins get accumulated in the holy Dham. They pile up and it creates a burden on the holy Dham. But when the pure devotee goes, he actually removes that accumulation of impious activities. So Prabhupada explains, so when the holy places of pilgrimage become piled up with all the sinful reaction of common man, a saintly person, when he goes there, he makes the holy place clean. The holy place becomes unclean due to the common men coming there and leaving their sinful reaction. So holy place becomes overburdened with the sinful results of other people. But in that holy place where a devotee goes, then again the holy place becomes cleansed. This is the idea, Bhavad Vita Bhagavata. So visiting the holy Dham, it's a great opportunity. You take advantage. We have devotees leaving today, one devotee in particular, she's going today to the holy Dham, and she'll be fully absorbed in all the nectar that Mayapur has to offer. And then the next point that we talked at, Prabhupada mentions, we'll talk about, is that the debts once we are born. So we're born with so many debts. We're born with debts to the demigods, born with debts to our parents, born with debts to the guru, and so on. So it's actually three: the demigods, the parents, and the sages. They're the three ones. So how is our debt to the demigods relieved? Does anyone know? Yes, very good. And our debt to the parents, how is that alleviated? It's really interesting, that one.
Children.
Yes, children. And I was thinking about that yesterday, that the reason why that's so important is because in Vedic culture, there's always the Shraddha, which is the sacrifice, the yajna you perform when the parent leaves. So that pinda is offered to them and they will actually get the benefit in their, wherever they are, the next life they've gone to. So that's alleviated by having children. And of course, hopefully the children will also take care of the parents, but that's to be seen. And then a debt to the stages, the debt to the sages is alleviated by the study of the Vedas. So they're very interesting. And of course, I haven't mentioned the great big debt which we have to Srila Prabhupada. So without Srila Prabhupada, I can unequivocally state that without Prabhupada, there would be no chanting of the holy name in the Western world. There would be no wonderful societies, no wonderful temples set up, so we can all come together and collectively make spiritual advancement. So our debt to Srila Prabhupada is actually a debt. We can't repay that debt. We can repay debt to the demigods, the parents, the sages. But to Prabhupada, we can't repay that debt. We can only try and repay that debt by following his instructions and following in his footsteps. We can't ever reach Prabhupada's level, but by that service attitude, Prabhupada will give us the Kripa Siddhi, which is the mercy of the spiritual master. So following Prabhupada's instructions is one way we can show our gratitude, because in that purport it talks about gratitude. So it's very, very important that we have that gratitude to Prabhupada, we have that gratitude to our spiritual master and our gratitude to our leaders and managers and to each other. It's very important because together we're strong. So we can model correct behavior by following Prabhupada's instructions. And it's useless to try and speculate and employ guesswork. Just follow. And when you read Nectar of Devotion, it gives very specific instructions on how we can follow this path of bhakti, even how we sit in the temple, what we do when we come in, how do we offer obeisances, how do we take, even how we offer obeisances, 2 hands on the ground, how we, the different kinds of obeisances, and how we should conduct ourselves. Don't drink in front of the deities, don't eat in front of the deities, sit properly in front of the deities. And when you hear that japa chant of Prabhupada, you'll hear him say, sit properly. And Sukla told me that tape was actually recorded in Melbourne, and one devotee had their legs out, or one guest had their legs out, and Prabhupada said, sit properly. So all of that, and Nectar of Devotion, at least up to 19, chapter 19, is a really good guide. It's all there, all the different offences that we can commit just when we're coming into the temple. It's very important. And then finally, in the translation that we just read, is that the Brahmanas were given cows in charity. So cow protection plays such an integral role in our lives, and especially in the farming communities. And in New Govardhana, we are very focused on our cow protection. And in a letter, because cows bring all auspiciousness, it's just not about the fact that they produce milk. They bring all auspiciousness. All the demigods reside in the different parts of the cow's body. So they are not just, economic units that they will bring in this much money and they cost that much money. It's not even about that. It's about offering that protection to the creatures that Krishna loved so much. So in a letter to Rupanuga, Rupanuga is a very wonderful devotee, Prabhupada writes, our cows are happy, therefore they give plenty of milk. Vedic civilization gives protection to all the living creatures, especially the cows, because they render such valuable service to the human society in the shape of milk, without which no one can become healthy and strong. Sorry, any vegans sitting here? Milk, especially milk from our cows, is so important. In your country, the dog is protected and the cow is killed. The dog is passing stool and urine in the street. He is considered the best friend of man. And the cow is all pure, stool, urine, and milk, but they are taken to the slaughterhouse and killed for food. What kind of civilization is this? Therefore, we have to preach against all this nonsense. So let's have our little quiz. So, amongst all the devotees of the Lord, there are several divisions. Which main ones did Prabhupada describe in the purport? Very good. Well done. Nityasiddha and Sadhanasiddha. Then how would you define a Sadhanasiddha devotee? Yes, very good. They're conditioned souls and they've achieved self-realization for the perfection of sadhana. Then how would you define a Nityasiddha devotee? Yes, eternally perfect. And in the translation to text 25, which was the first verse we read, where did the incarnations of the demigods go? These relatives of Krishna. What place did they go to? Prabhas. Very good. And where did the eternal devotees go? Yes. And what does Narottam Das Thakur say about devotional service? It's the last word in spiritual perfection. I really like that phrase, the last word in spiritual perfection. And then what are the 3 debts we are born with? Very good. You're going to ace your HSC, for sure. And how do we alleviate these debts? How do we alleviate our debt to the demigods? By jagya, yes. And by sacrifice. And to the parents? Yes. And to the sages? Very good. So thank you very much for putting up with my very stuffy nose. And somehow or other, I'm so grateful to the Lord. I've just non-stop since I woke up this morning, I've just been blowing my nose non-stop. And I was thinking, how can I possibly sit here and give class? I'm just going to be blowing my nose, but my nose stopped running. It's a miracle. Thank you. So, are there any questions or comments? Any feedback? Julian?
Thank you for the class. I just want to clarify one point about the two parents. So by us having children, we can pay our debt to parents.
Yes, yes. So we all have that debt. That doesn't mean that, this is according to like the Vedic custom, that there are taking sannyas, remaining brahmachari. They're also very perfect stages of life. It's not that one must beget children, but that's one way. Because when one takes sannyas or remains brahmachari for their entire life, nashtika brahmachari, then everything is benefited. Hare Krishna. Roger?
You mentioned how I think Prabhupada said in the purpose that some devotees are mature in sadhana siddha, no? Did you say that?
Yes, but they are still nityasiddhas, but they're mixed in that context because their execution of devotional service is perfect. So they're not like the devotees mentioned in this purport, where it talks about the sadhana siddhas, and out of the sadhana siddhas, they can be mixed with philosophical speculation, gyanis. Yes. Yes, it's very interesting that different category Prabhupada gives. So they're eternally liberated, and they also have that extra thing of being perfect in their devotional service, executing their devotional service. So I just brought that up because it's interesting to see how our philosophy, or the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, is multifaceted and nuanced.
So basically, as I understand, it means that they were already perfect, but they're showing the example doing a perfect sadhana.
Yes, in their perfect devotional service.
What about Narada Muni? Is he eternally Nityasiddha?
Yes, Prabhupada gives him as an example.
But in the story of the Bhagavatam, he's
Yes, it's true. That's correct. But we don't know what plan Krishna has there. He may appear to have been, that servant child and the child of the servant. But in that 7th canto purport, Prabhupada uses him as an example. Okay, thank you, everyone. Jai Glory to Srila Prabhupada.